there's real pogroms happening. But these Hasidic leaders in their own sermons are railing against the spiritual pogrom, which means assimilation.
Hello, everyone. My name is Frida Beisel, and on this channel, I explore various topics on Judaism, New York City, Yiddish, Hasidism, and more. Today, I'll be talking to Glenn Dynner, who is a Polish Jewish historian with specialties in social and economic history, gender, and for my audience especially, Hasidism. He is the J. Berkowitz Chair of Jewish History at University of Virginia in the Department of History. Here's a special little fact about Professor Dynner. When I was a student at Sarah Lawrence College, Glenn was my professor. In fact, he got me started on my career and played an instrumental role in my work. Glenn has written numerous books and articles on Polish pre-war Judaism/Hasidism, among them being Men of Silk, the Hasidic Conquest of Polish Jewish Society, Yankel's Tavern, Jewish Liquor and Life in the Kingdom of Poland, The Light of Learning, Hasidism in Poland on the Eve of the Holocaust. I will link all of these in the video description. Welcome, Glenn, and thank you so much. I'm so happy you're here. And by the way, I don't know, at Sarah Lawrence, everyone called you Glenn. Is that how you go by everyone?
It works for me. It works for me, especially you, Frida. You have definitely earned the right.
I see.
But it's interesting because now I'm in the world where everybody goes by professor and doctor, and sometimes I don't know who they're talking to when they address me. But Sarah Lawrence is a very informal place, which is great. So yes, please call me Glenn. That way you can also avoid mispronouncing Diner, which everybody always does.
Oh, it's dinner?
I always get dinner. Yeah, no, it is Diner. Oh, it's correct.
It is Diner. Okay, yeah.
But sometimes I go through entire episodes as dinner, and I'm sort of too shy to interrupt and correct me.
So. I relate because I've sometimes become a weasel in the process of being Weisel, so I get it. Yeah. Well, I'm super happy that we get to talk today. Long time since our days at Sarah Lawrence College. I would love to get started with your work, which has been so influential in my own learning and has been in so many ways so relevant to what I'm interested in myself. So can you get started with maybe what got you started in Jewish studies and where you began from early days?
Absolutely. I mean, I think what got me started in Jewish studies is reading the books that were formative to the field, which was really in formation in the second half of the 20th century. So books by Michael Stanislavski, Steve Zipperstein, Antony Polonsky, my own mentor and doctoral advisor eventually, and books by Ezra Mendelsohn and Jonathan Frankel. I mean, these were books which were so crucial, which created a foundation for the field of East European Jewish history. But they also had a framing that I very early on began to challenge. Because their own parents' generation was often immigrants or survivors of the Holocaust, they tended to de-emphasize things like tradition or traditionalism, and they tended to de-emphasize anti-Jewish violence. The idea was to get away from what Salo Baron called the lachrymose conception of Jewish history, which was sort of teaching Jewish history as maybe it's taught in still today in more traditional settings as a long history of victimization. And
what does lachrymose mean?
The term lachrymose just means gloomy, depressing, negative. And instead they wanted to, in their own rebellion, they wanted to really emphasize the positive. So that means positive aspects of Jewish-Christian relations or Polish-Jewish relations, de-emphasizing violence and focusing on really important aspects of Jewish life that you might call affirmative, such as institutions, autonomous institutions of self-government, for example. And if you get into the interwar period, the emphasis is on secular political parties like Zionist and socialist and other kinds of secularist movements. So that was the legacy that I had, was this real emphasis on the kind of positive axiomatic features of East European Jewish life. They're not so backward. They're not so victim. They're not they're not so traditional. And the attempt to really emphasize or overemphasize secularism and secularization and positive relations between Jews and Christians, which is an important corrective. But as a contrarian, as a grad student, I found that I was bumping up against the limits of that framing because, come on, I mean, you have very serious anti-Jewish violence happening, not necessarily in the early part of Polish Jewish history as much, but definitely you get into the 16th, 17th centuries, you have blood libel accusations, Khmelnytsky massacres, and then finally waves of pogroms, and then the Holocaust. And the Holocaust was always set off as this separate, immensely tragic event that didn't really belong to Jewish history that preceded it. You know, that was the picture we were getting. And I found that division artificial too. So what do I do as a grad student? I decide I'm going to study Hasidism, and I'm going to look at anti-Jewish violence, and I'm going to look at the more so-called backward areas, the shtetl and the liquor trade and the tavern keeping that was such a crucial part of these interactions. It's really at the center of Jewish-Christian interactions on a daily basis. And, I came up with work that was meant to be a corrective to that, in the sense that, I really, really have been striving to integrate Hasidism, integrate anti-Jewish violence, integrate the tavern and the shtetl into this very important legacy of relative security and prosperity that my own professors, my own advisors had given me.
To that end, did you go to Poland to study there?
So what I did very early on is I went to Poland in order to learn Polish and to just travel around and climb fences and get into...
What does that mean?
Meaning climbing fences to get into Jewish cemeteries that had been abandoned, and we're trying to get inside old synagogues that were no longer functioning. And there's always like one person who has the key that you kind of have to pay off to enter. And it's this tragic abandoned space. But for me, it was poignant and beautiful.
Glenn, my first trip to Poland was in June this year. I went to Krakow for the Jewish Culture Festival. And I've been thinking about Poland a lot since my trip. I'm actually working on a video about my experience. What years were you there and what was it like?
So I first went to Poland in the 90s. And that was when the country was just coming out of communism. And you could see each year it become a little brighter, a little more free, a little more tourist friendly.
Wow.
And so it was a really exciting time to be going there. And there was also excitement about the field of Jewish studies in Poland. You had young scholars starting to study Polish Jewish history themselves. And so, it was a very exciting time. At the same time, it was a difficult time because incidents like the Yad Vabna massacre that happened, it was just coming to light, the work of Jan Gross. And so that really troubled the waters of Polish-Jewish relations too. Poles had always considered themselves to be victims during the Holocaust, and here they were being portrayed as persecutors. So it was all a very kind of difficult transition that happened, that had to happen. And I think ultimately, it was good for the country to process this very difficult legacy of anti-Jewish violence and anti-Semitism.
Wow. Having done a little bit of content about Poland, I do find that there is a very strong internal argument, maybe it's not internal, between Polish people and Jews that plays out, for instance, in my comment section. I didn't experience it in the country itself, of course, but there is this argument that the Poles were suffering in the Holocaust, and I get a lot of these comments of what did the Jews do to help. I wasn't in Poland long enough to understand the sentiments that the Polish people have about the Holocaust, but in my comment section, I have been surprised and upset by a lot of what I see. Have you experienced when you were there, for instance, anti-Semitism?
It's funny, I don't really experience anti-Semitism in Poland. I experience it more back home. And I think it might be just the circles that I'm traveling in Poland. There are a lot of people of goodwill who are trying to get beyond this anti-Semitism, and they don't like the legacy of anti-Semitism. And so I've had really good experiences overall. Maybe occasionally something negative would happen, but that's really anywhere. So it's been important to me as a historian to try to get us beyond this notion of Poland as this intrinsically anti-Semitic place. It's just one big Jewish cemetery, because it is where most of the concentration camps were. And so that kind of colors your whole view of the country. But we can't forget that it was a Nazi occupation under which this all happened, without downplaying, the role of definitely there was a Polish role in this whole thing, and it's very difficult to talk about. There was collaboration. There was just passive neglect of the Jewish population, but there's also heroism and rescue and really inspiring stories too. And we just need to try to figure out what the balance was if we want to get a good picture. And I think that's really, honestly, the project of history itself, is to try to find these balances, because inevitably we have to generalize, and we're not going to generalize anything accurately. But if you can find a rough balance, which is funny because it relates to my recent book, which actually I have right here, The Light of Learning, which was an attempt to try to find that balance of cultural forces in Jewish life into our really pre-Holocaust Poland. Try to figure out, so was this story of secularization really accurate? To what extent was it accurate? To what extent were the photographs of Roman Vishniak overframing this traditional impoverished community, which he's been accused of doing, and which the correctives all tried to sort of get away from? To what extent, though, do we have to come back to that picture? Because what I'm finding in my own research is that these Hasidic communities and other Orthodox communities are extremely large. They're extremely vital. Even in major cities, they have, large enclaves where they're extremely, I would say, predominant. And the institution building that goes on in the wake of World War I is astounding. The building or rebuilding of the cheder, of yeshivas, these institutions tell their own story. So when all is said and done, I came out with a balance that was much more traditionalist than had been previously thought. Still, I would say over half of the Jews of Poland, significantly more than half probably, were what we would call Hasidic or Orthodox. And the great historians of the interwar period had tended to emphasize the more secular-oriented Jewish groups, the Zionists, the Bundists, and so on. So that was my intervention.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It's something I relate to in my own work. The choices that storytellers make shapes the narrative, and they bring only their own eyes. and their eyes are limited, obviously. And then there's a corrective, and the corrective sometimes is too delegitimating of earlier work. I think that's really interesting. The way we pick from facts and make a narrative is something that I'm interested in general. And it's such a challenging process. It's such an interesting process. So let's talk about your early project, and we'll get to your more recent work later. What was your first project as a big undertaking that you were studying?
Well, so I should say I come from a really reform assimilated background. And so I was drawn at Brandeis as an undergrad to studying the history of the Hasidic movement. And it was an exciting time to study Hasidism because Moshe Rossman had just discovered the Baal Shem Tov on a tax list, actually a tax exemption list in the archives. And it was the first time you realized that you can actually study Hasidism in the same way that the rest of Polish history or Polish Jewish history has been studied, with archival sources that you can ultimately blend with, other kinds of sources like inner Hasidic sources, perhaps homiletic literature, and even hagiography. You can get a much fuller picture. So that really excited me. So I wrote my dissertation on Hasidism in the Kingdom of Poland, which was a very urbanized environment. It was much less of an emphasis on dynasties and Hasidic courts, and much more into learning and other kinds of urban pursuits. And so I found a really Polish Hasidism, if you're talking about central Poland, with everyone from, the Maggid of Kozienice, the Seer of Lublin, the Kotzker Rebbe, Simcha Bunim of Shischa, on to Ger and Alexander, and these later groups. It really struck me as a very special kind of Hasidism because it managed to flourish very early on in the urban environment and really shied away from a lot of the excesses of the big flamboyant courts like was happening in the Rizhner dynasty and other kinds, other kinds of, or other types of dynasties. So I wrote my dissertation on this, and I became fascinated with the mercantile elites who had actually been patrons to Hasidism early on. These are international merchants, very sophisticated, worldly individuals who chose Hasidism because, without being emancipated, they couldn't really find the kind of respect and esteem in the courts of the nobility and other places that you would try to get integrated into in Western Europe. And so they kind of formed their own sort of system of patronage and their own kings, so to speak, who were the tzaddikim, or the rebbes. And so it was a very interesting phenomenon for me to see how Hasidism was so integrated into the lifeblood of this very vital mercantile economy in Poland, really at the cusp of the Industrial Revolution.
And that became your book?
And that became Men of Silk.
Your first?
Yeah.
That became Men of Silk. I see. I'm just curious. I'm trying to get a mental picture of what it takes for a American young lad interested in Jewish roots. Do you have Polish roots yourself?
If you go back far enough, yes. But I think that's true of every Ashkenazic Jew.
Okay. So you're interested in the roots of your Ashkenazi Jewry, going to Poland and studying this very, very different world. It wasn't a religious learning for you, right?
Well, okay. So let me try to answer this in a certain way. I always shied away from genealogy. I don't feel like that's my main motivation, is self-discovery and all this. It's just where most of the world's Jews lived. 3/4 of the world's Jewish population lived in these Polish-speaking lands. And so I couldn't understand why everyone wasn't studying this. I found out why. It's very hard to learn Polish and Yiddish and Hebrew, and to learn Hebrew well enough where you can read rabbinic and Hasidic sources and, in that kind of Hebrew. It was certainly spiritually fulfilling at times, but I don't think that was my main motivation. My main motivation is honestly to try to find what moves this society. What is this Polish Jewish world? And that's what brought me to Hasidism. And I have to say that in this last book, where I delved very, very deeply into Hasidic homiletic literature, sermons, which are often, very, very intricate drashot. It wasn't that often that I was inspired spiritually by this later Hasidism, not in the same way as when I would read, Kedushat Levi or something, There are a few moments where something like the Shem Mishmuel would inspire me, or the Piaseczna Rebbe in the midst of the Warsaw Ghetto. That's very inspiring, but most of the time it's actually very reactionary and almost obsessed, surprisingly obsessed with what they called the spiritual pogroms. So yes, there were real pogroms raging at certain periods, in 1918, 19, and then in 1936, other times too. There's real pogroms happening, but these Hasidic leaders in their own sermons are railing against the spiritual pogrom, which means assimilation. Going to Polish schools, going to universities, that is much more of a threat. In other words, Gentiles are more dangerous when they're nice to you than when they're terrible to you. And that was a very surprising message to find throughout this Hasidic literature. It's not one that's spiritually kind of inspiring to me, but it's fascinating, because in the midst of pogroms, they're worried much more about universities and other secularizing influences and how to combat them. The spiritual pogrom, I found that actually really, really interesting.
It's very interesting to me also that oftentimes there's a narrative that post-Holocaust Hasidism in its contemporary flavor was born out of the Holocaust, as a reaction to the Holocaust, that fear of assimilation comes from the Holocaust. But what we see with your work, for instance, is that fear of assimilation existing to such a strong degree before.
Absolutely. It's even slightly before World War I, but really picks up after World War I, because the Zionists and the Yiddishist socialists have their own school systems, and the youth are starting to really stray and join these youth movements. And so there's a real moral panic that happens. That's why you have Agudat Yisrael, but Agudat Yisrael, which is mainly Ger, it's at least led by Ger.
Can you explain what it is?
Agudat Yisrael is a political party, but also a political movement with clubs and affiliated yeshivas and school systems, the Chorev school system. And it's sort of like the first time that Hasidism had been politicized at this level, where it really becomes all-encompassing. But many Hasidic groups were not part of Agudat Yisrael. And so they found their own ways of coping with modernity, coping with these secularist movements. And what they all agreed upon was that education was going to be key, Torah learning. So they're all building yeshivot. Belz is a bit of an exception, but they too have their yeshivas and their own style of learning. The point is that Torah learning is the only antidote to this secular modernity. And it's universal among Hasidic and Orthodox Jews that this is going to be the solution. This is going to save the youth. And so there's an enormous effort to try to really build and improve the educational system so that you have Torah learning happening at a very high level. sometimes for the sake of government funding, sometimes with 2 hours a day of secular education too, even in major yeshivas.
It's interesting because it is so reminiscent of what's happening in New York today.
So let me say one thing about this, because you did mention this before. I think there are changes after the Holocaust. I think that this worldliness of, say, Ger Hasidism, which is one of these really biggest dynasty in Poland, it becomes much more militant after the Holocaust. And that worldliness is something that's really lost to a great extent. You had youth groups and choirs and libraries, and you had a sort of openness to the secular world in a very selective way, of course, and that was lost. That was lost after the Holocaust. And another thing that I should mention, since you brought up the post-war period, and of course, you know this world much better than I do, this whole phenomenon where you have entirely Hasidic areas, something like Borough Park or Williamsburg, that doesn't exist in Poland or the rest of Eastern Europe. Jews are living much more interspersed. So the everyday geography is very different. You can walk down the street and be passing a workers' club that's affiliated with the Bund, and a Zionist tea house, and a Stiebel, and it's all much more intermingled. And I think that's crucial too, because instead of this bifurcation that you have in America, it's much more of an encounter, a forced encounter between these secularist and traditionalist kinds of influences. And they're all trying to navigate this, and they're all trying to weigh how much they can accept from the other and still remain authentic. So you have Zionist leaders who are acting like rabbis and even giving sermons like Rebbe. It's they take on, especially if they come from Hasidic households, they take on a lot of the these kinds of leadership patterns that they're used to seeing. It's just secularized. And from the other side, the Hasidic courts, the Hasidic leadership, they start experimenting with theater and music and secular education, and newspapers is a big one, and of course political parties too. So it was a real time of experimentation that's almost forced by this very close proximity. Everybody's pretty intermingled, certainly compared to today.
Amid all of this, what's Hasidism's and Hasidic leaders' response to anti-Semitism?
I have to be really careful here, because I can't say that they want it, but they don't hate it to the extent that it vindicates this traditionalist worldview. You see, you can never really trust them. You can never really be accepted. It's a wall against assimilation, which is what they really fear the most. They really fear that the most. Now, nobody could have predicted that anti-Semitism was going to lead to a mass genocide, to the Holocaust, to annihilation of the entire community. Nobody could have predicted that. There are some cases where secular Yiddishists did seem to predict it. Okay, but there's secular Yiddishists who tend to be a pretty pessimistic group. For the most part, Hasidic and Orthodox Jews were optimistic about the future. This storm shall pass. And the important thing is that our communities, that we're not losing our youth to assimilation. In that mentality, anti-Semitism isn't as big a problem. It's only a problem when it becomes lethal on a mass scale, with major pogroms or, of course, the Holocaust.
When there is an attack, a pogrom or whatever, what was the leadership's advice on how to handle it?
So the advice was to have faith in the tzaddikim, in the rabbis. We will pray on your behalf. We will intervene with the authorities on your behalf. So it wasn't all just just kind of magical thinking, not to insult anybody's religious sensibilities, but it was also really a pretty pragmatic approach. We will lobby, we will bribe whatever officials we need to. And this is the way it's always been done. And it works most of the time until, of course, it doesn't work. This technique of lobbying, what's called stadlanut, it does still work to an extent, even throughout the worst pogrom waves and so on. But at a certain point, the Polish Jewish youth are looking much more towards the Bund, which is organizing self-defense units, and the Zionists too, to an extent. And so that's what Hasidism's up against, is they haven't really innovated a physical response to pogroms in the way that these more secularist movements had. They discourage it. They're right in the sense that it can actually inflame violence. It can make it worse. It can really backfire.
Meaning self-defense.
Anytime a minority engages in self-defense, in physical violence, it could go either way. It can really make things worse. Their way was to continue to intervene with authorities, as they'd always done for centuries. But now you also have the world on your side. You can foment protest on an international scale, among American Jews, and they would do this as well. So it was evolving. Also, they can participate in the Polish parliament, which is known as the Sejm, and they can make thunderous speeches, protests against this violence. But what I found is much more than protesting the violence. The Orthodox and Hasidic representatives in the Polish Sejm would protest things like the anti-shechita legislation, the laws against kosher slaughtering, which were being introduced and debated. And that was still much more of a threat in their eyes. That Jews would eat. Can you
speak to that?
Yeah, sure. The idea that Jews would eat non-kosher meat because it's just too rare or expensive as a result of this anti-kosher slaughtering legislation. That was really seen when I looked through the press, and I went through the entire Aguda press, das Jüdische Tagblatt. I found that the speeches and the editorials that were produced were much more concerned with the laws against kosher slaughtering that were being introduced, restricting and trying to ban it altogether. That was where their effort was. And when it came to protesting pogroms, they gave permission, even encouraged participation in a Bundes-led strike and demonstration. But it's not led by Hasidic leaders. It's just, it's not their main concern. The body may be endangered, but the soul has to be safe, and endangering the soul is much more serious. It's very hard, I think, for those of us raised in a secular environment to get that.
Yeah, I know. It's very hard for anyone who doesn't appreciate the longevity of the soul and the meaning of the soul to make sense of a world in which perishing for Kiddush Hashem, martyrdom, is a concept without it seeming to people really cultish or disturbing. But I do understand it.
Martyrdom's a really interesting problem, though, because it's also not encouraged. It's this is you're what I find, especially during the Nazi occupation, is you do everything you can to stay alive, and but you can definitely risk your life to study Torah in one of these underground yeshiva bunkers that I actually write about as well. People would bring you food and basically learn Torah until the bitter end. Yeah, it's something that's pretty inspiring. And again, maybe a little difficult to understand in the secular world, but that was more important than fighting in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, in a lot of people's minds.
Can you expand on what was happening with these students studying Torah, and you go into it in depth in the book?
Yes. And I don't want to exaggerate, the extent of this. A lot of Hasidic Jews during the Holocaust just gave up observance and shaved their beards and tried to survive any way they could. But a surprising large amount, more than was previously thought, I think. I keep discovering these cells, these underground yeshiva bunkers in various cities, but especially in Warsaw, Krakow, and Łódź or Lodz, smaller towns as well. They would, a few hundred yeshiva students and Beis Yaakov students would just study full time, and people would bring them their food. They wouldn't actually they wouldn't register, so they wouldn't even have any kind of tickets in order to get food. They would just try to remain completely anonymous and secretive and just go on doing what they always have been doing, which is learning.
Did they have their leadership to guide them in this?
Yes, they really did, although a lot of them seem to have been spontaneous. You did have in these various Hasidic groups this kind of militant hardcore of youth who had already sort of cut themselves off from the rest of society. They weren't the majority at this point. They were a small elite, but these are the ones who would go underground. But occasionally, there are cases of Rosh Yeshivas joining them, or forming these sessions, and it's really inspiring. And in a Hanukkah sermon that I quoted in the book, at one of these yeshiva bunkers, the students are told that you are the oil that is allowing this light of learning to continue through all this darkness. It's very moving kinds of expressions of just being inspired by this holy act. Now, that's not exactly martyrdom, but it's also not exactly resistance or any other more practical way of escaping this fate. It's something that just, again, elevates the soul over the body.
What else can you speak to that you found in your research on Hasidism during the Holocaust? I'm thinking of in your book, you were referencing particular examples or testimonies.
Wow, there's a lot. I mean, we've talked about education. We've talked about, the underground yeshiva bunkers during the Holocaust. And, I think the research that I did just really, really enhanced for me this sense of revitalization that happens. A great example is Lubavitcher Hasidism, which isn't normally associated with Poland. I found these incredible archival sources on this one town, Gluboki, in which there are 4 Chabad-led Stieblech, and the rabbi is actually a religious Zionist, and the Zionists try to sort of take control over the town and take it away from this assistant rabbi who had been Lubavitch. And you really see how Lubavitcher Hasidim mobilize. Even at this phase, they just mobilize this incredible network of lobbying, bribery, philanthropy, and every other kind of mechanism to regain their power. And they succeed. They not only succeed in retaking that rabbinical post, but they actually create a Lubavitcher yeshiva branch right in the town. It's kind of like planting a flag, Now, this is going to extend into the Holocaust, because at that point, really since 1933, Lubavitcher has moved its headquarters to Poland, and they they are essentially, a Polish Hasidic group at this point. But when the Holocaust begins, they seem to be much better organized to survive. And what this means is really rescuing the best yeshiva students. So in Tomchei Tmimim Yeshiva, which is the Lubavitcher Yeshiva, they managed to rescue a huge number, get them out of Poland and into Lithuania, which is neutral at that point, and finally get them to the United States and other centers. And they form really a major core of the revitalization of Hasidism and Orthodoxy in the United States and in Israel once Israel's established. So you see that the Lubavitcher Rebbe first, he's rescued, and this whole rescue of Rebbes is also a fascinating phenomenon. He's rescued by a Nazi officer. It's an incredible story. The Secret Service, Nazi Secret Service gets him out. This is before the U.S. has declared war or entered the war. And once he reaches the United States, he devotes all of his energies to rescuing as many yeshiva students and other Hasidic and other spiritual leaders. And he succeeds to a pretty good extent if we're going to consider what the odds were, that you'd get, so many yeshiva students out.
Wow. What about the female?
So that's the Achilles heel, right? Throughout much of my work, I've tried to show what female Hasidism is. Like, what does it mean to be a Hasidah, or what does it mean to be a Hasidic woman? And there have been historians who have tried to deny that it's even possible, which is unfortunate. Women really do play an extraordinarily important role in these Hasidic communities early on. They often will manage the entire courts. They have their own customs. It might not look like Hasidism in the sense that, sitting around the Rebbe's table and studying in a Hasidic yeshiva, but it's its own form of kind of vernacular religious practice and customs and curating Hasidic tales and all kinds of Hasidic, sacred objects and so on. But at the end of the day, when this whole system is stressed in the way it is during the Holocaust, priority is definitely given to yeshiva students who are predominantly male. Now, that's not entirely true. There are exceptions, but for the most part, it's the boys. It's saving the boys. But let us not forget that in prioritizing the rescue of yeshiva students, and this is not just Hasidic organizations, it's not even religious organizations, it's even organizations like the Joint and other organizations. They prioritize yeshiva students over lawyers, engineers, doctors, and other secular Jewish professionals. And that's an extraordinary phenomenon too. And I think what's happening there, and they even will express this, they'll articulate the reason for this, is that Torah learning seems to be, at least in the eyes of these American rescuers, that is the unique legacy of East European Jewry, right? Lawyers, we have plenty of. Doctors, engineers, we have plenty of. But these Talmudic scholars have to be rescued if we're going to preserve something of that East European Jewish culture that is, quote unquote, authentic. And that proves to be a matter of life or death.
The process of picking who to rescue and who not to rescue is always going to be mired in such difficult moral dilemmas. I can't even wrap my head around it or try to judge it in any which way. I do understand what you're saying. I follow the logic in terms of what they were rescuing by rescuing yeshiva bachers. Speaking of the female constituency, let's pivot for a second here, and then maybe we can start to wrap this up. Can you speak to any interesting female characters in pre-war Hasidism?
Well, Sarah Schneer comes immediately to mind because she actually creates an entire school system. It's co-opted by Aguda or Agudat Yisrael, but this is her creation. She remains a kind of spiritual leader of the movement throughout, even after her death. So she's a very important and interesting figure. I would also say, though, that there are other, maybe less well-known female Hasidic characters that we have a lot of information about. One that comes to mind is Eula Wald, who is a relatively unknown diarist. She keeps a diary throughout World War I and beyond. She writes it in Polish, and this is available in the YIVO archives to this day. It's currently being translated. It's just an extraordinary account of kind of a typical Hasidic teenage daughter whose parents run a tavern. And she's mainly, feeling confined by this world. She's missing out on a lot of the excitement of her more secularized Jewish peers. But at the end of the day, she marries a Hasidic gentleman who's actually a lawyer, and she manages to kind of find a balance. So she's a pretty interesting figure. Esther Kreitman is another figure. She's the sister of the Singer brothers, the famous authors, and she writes a kind of autobiographical novel, which hews pretty closely to her own experiences as a Hasidic woman. And this is largely negative. She feels very marginalized. She feels like she doesn't have a place there. But for a more positive example, I would say Malka Shapira is a very important case. And there are others as well. The Rebbe's Daughter, if you've ever seen this translation by Nehemiah Polin, is another really important account, of a Hasidic woman who takes you behind the scenes. You can see how the kitchen is so crucial to this female Hasidic world, and other spaces as well that you wouldn't necessarily have access to if you just read literature that's produced by men.
Yeah. Speaking of Yulia Wald, makes me think of Taverns and the book you wrote about tavern keeping, which is, let me look at it, Yankel's Tavern, Jews, Liquor, and Life in the Kingdom of Poland. Can you briefly explain what that's about?
Sure. So I found that taverns lay at the heart of Polish and Polish Jewish society and socioeconomic life and even cultural life, even Jewish Christian interactions. These taverns were by and large run by Jews. They leased them from the nobility, who came to believe that Jews were more sober and more business savvy and more literate than non-Jews. And so they would only lease their taverns to Jews and distilleries. After the partitions of Poland, when the entire economy becomes liquor because you can no longer export grain as easily, this elevates the importance of the tavern keeper. They were much more than tavern keepers. They were entertainers. They were bankers on a small scale. They were store owners, restaurateurs, and so on. They would mediate disputes. They played a really, really important role in Polish society, especially in rural areas. And so the figure of the Jewish tavern keeper, it looms really large, especially in Polish literature. And, no one really understood why. Like, how did it happen that Jews emerged as the tavern keepers? It seems so incongruous. There really is a story here that I think is important, because what begins as a kind of marginal pursuit, tavern keeping is not the most respectable occupation in the world, after the partitions of Poland becomes more and more lucrative, more and more central to local life and local economies. And suddenly Jews are actually being valued and even cherished, certainly in a pragmatic way, cherished. And so I wanted to tell this story. The problem is once taverns and the liquor trade becomes more and more lucrative, and it becomes, 60, 70, 80% of estate revenues, for the nobility, then jealousy emerges. And there are all these efforts to push Jews out of the liquor trade based on the logic that they're responsible for the widespread peasant drunkenness that we see. Now, they didn't bother to look at where Jews actually don't reside and don't run taverns, and the peasants are just as drunk there. But this became a major force throughout the 19th century. But what I found in the book is the nobles who own the taverns and the locals who frequented them actually did their part to protect and conceal the Jewish tavern keepers. And they would actually create fronts, Christian fronts for these taverns. That's how indispensable the Jewish tavern keepers were in the eyes of the nobility. And so occasionally at this point, Poland's been partitioned, so you have Tsarist government officials, Habsburg officials, to a lesser extent, Prussian officials, who are sometimes discovering that Jews are continuing to run taverns and continuing to sell liquor to the peasants, and therefore exploit them and addict them to drink and so on. And that's a persistent theme, but it always seems to go back to normal after the storm passes. And Jews just are reinstalled in these taverns. So it really becomes kind of the story of the 18th and 19th century in Polish Jewish history. It's the story of taverns that often takes us out of major urban centers. The focus has often been on merchants and on mercantile pursuits and bankers. But if you go throughout the smaller towns, so-called Städte, you will find there more than one tavern with a Jewish tavern keeper. And that's the way life is experienced, certainly by travelers, who give their testimonies, and by locals. It's really interesting because the end of Jewish tavern keeping seems to coincide with the rise of real hostility, anti-Jewish violence. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that Jews have lost this very indispensable occupation. With once the liquor monopoly, the nobles had a liquor monopoly. Once that's ended at the end of the 19th century, life becomes a lot more dangerous for Jews, even though they're emancipated. It's incredible.
Wow. Incredible. What are you working on now?
So I'd like to write a lachrymose history of Polish Jewry, where I know I'm a contrarian, I know. But I would really like to revisit violence as a rubric for understanding the course that Polish Jewish history takes. Because if you ignore violence, you don't really understand all these measures that were put in place to prevent it, and all these measures that were taken to respond in very creative ways to violence. So everything from institutions of autonomy, the budgets of the Kehillah, the Jewish community, where it would include a line where you have to pay bribes to the Jesuit students so they won't attack the Jewish community. These are very important formative aspects of violence. The literature that emerges is also really important. And what I would say with respect to the 20th century, to the interwar period, I think to a great extent, the role that violence plays in bolstering traditionalism and Hasidism, bolstering it, at a time when historians usually assume that religion is in decline. And that's something that really fascinates me. So I'd really like to look at the way violence is not only destructive, but it's actually formative. And I think that'll help us tell the story of Polish Jewry in a richer and deeper way that doesn't sort of navigate around these unpleasant incidents, which sometimes happens.
I find the concept of violence being formative very interesting. Obviously, it's related to the larger struggle of meaning making. And when we confront violence, we make meaning, which of course is formative. So that's going to be a book.
Yeah, so that's a plan for the next book, but I'm going way back to the Middle Ages. And I'm plowing through a lot of very interesting arcane material, the minutes to the Council of Four Lands and Pinkasim from smaller communities and rabbinical response literature, and try and understand really how did they respond creatively to these very challenging, dangerous situations. I think it's interesting because Poland really was relatively safe and prosperous for Jews for centuries, but it breaks down. It breaks down definitely, and there are eruptions like 1648, and we have to really try to figure out how these help create the story of Polish Jewry. It really was the largest and I think most vital Jewish community for many centuries. So many movements derive from Polish Jewry, not just Hasidism, but proto-Zionism and Jewish socialism and modern Jewish literature. They all come out of this extremely vital community. And that's what I really want to try to capture. But I think the violence is very much part of the story, as is the traditionalism. Both of these things, I feel, were downplayed by the prior generation of historians. When I say that with humility. I want to encourage everybody to read these great works, by Moshe Rossman and Gershon Hundert and Jonathan Frankel and Ezra Mendelsohn and Antony Polanski and so on. I want everybody to read them, but maybe you'll conclude with me that there's also something missing there.
I'm going to be linking to Glenn's books and articles in the video description. Thank you so much, Glenn, and also to everyone on YouTube and the podcast. Bye-bye.